This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Chauna Perry Finch as our guest. Chauna is a national speaker and a restorative school strategist. As a national speaker, Chauna provides engaging and informative keynote presentations that inspire and motivate educators and youth-serving agencies. In this conversation, you will hear topics of social working, restorative justice, and both of those things in a school setting. But before we get into this episode, I would like to remind you to go check out our merch. We have recently put out a new line for back-to-school restorative reminders, which you can find in the show notes below. Now, enough of me. Let's get into this conversation.
Well, Chauna, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a mother of 2 beautiful daughters.
Who are you?
I am the wife of an amazing man.
Who are you?
I am someone who's committed to bridging relationships.
Who are you?
I am the oldest of 5 children. One that we lost to asthma. The youngest.
Who are you?
I am someone who is pained by social injustices.
Who are you?
I am someone who's trying to put together the pieces to make schools better places for all people.
And finally, who are you?
I am Chauna, with lots of love and lots of light.
Well, Chauna, full of love, life, and all those other things that you shared with us. We're so thankful that you're here with us today. It is always good to check in at the start of these conversations. To the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm a little tired today, but it's something about this work that energizes me.
Yeah, and today is a unique time. I think you're the first person who has recorded this podcast from their school site, and you're just getting into the hustle and bustle of, a whole new school year, back in person, the way, I wouldn't say it's back to normal at all, but in the way that things were, before March of 2020, doing restorative justice work within the context of Milwaukee Public Schools. How has that transition been?
Well, it's day one here for students to return. It's come with different feelings, emotions, even fears for some. I personally am very excited that students are back in the building, and I hope that they can remain, that we don't have any health concerns that changes that, because it's been a hard road for our children with trying to learn online.
Yeah, absolutely. You said in one of your, who are you statements, building or bridging connections, like it's possible to do online. We've done it. It's been challenging, but there's something about being back in space with people. Even I've experienced that in the few times that I've been out in the world facilitating facilitating professional development. Things like, you get to walk around the room and say, "I like your shirt." Oh, thank you so much, right? You don't get that interaction on Zoom. As much as I miss being able to like dip into breakout rooms and eavesdrop or like savagely close out breakout rooms when it's time to end a discussion, right? We do miss that in-person interaction. You've been doing this work for a really long time, and this work in quotes probably before you knew the words restorative justice. So, in your own words, how did this journey get started for you?
Well, for me, it actually started with me being a school social worker. I've been a school social worker for many years. And one of the school social workers learned about restorative work, and she started a professional learning community, also known as PLC. And so any school social workers could join that group. And I was curious about it, so I went. And I sat in circle with some of my colleagues, and we talked about how we were doing. We used the circle process to share how we were doing and how things were going for us in our role. And it was very, very powerful. Those two questions that sound so simple, it's something about sitting in this circle that made me feel very interconnected with the people that I was with. There were some people in the PLC that I knew more than others. And I just kept thinking about the school, and I kept thinking about the children. And at the time, I was at a middle school, and I thought, wow, if students could have a space like this to talk with their teachers, with the staff, how that could really build some authentic relationships and dismantle some disconnect. And I went on to dream more about how I could even help the staff. And I was sold from there in that first circle, sitting with colleagues.
Yeah, what was it about that space that made you say, like, this is it?
Everybody had an opportunity to share. When someone wasn't sharing, everyone else was listening. And so just having that space to hear each other, there was a sense of calm in the space. And there was these natural connections and relationships being built just by listening to one another.
I think about circle spaces being unique from so many others that we navigate, even in things that are human service like social work and other things like that. I'm curious if there were times, even before you were introduced to restorative justice or the circle process, where you had similar feelings.
Yeah, but it was more, I would say that I really value people. And so that tends to shine through when I'm interacting with people, no matter what the age. And so I've always built relationships with the people that I work with, and especially with the students. And so that's where I saw restorative practices shining. I feel like it really connects with my personality when I think about valuing the people that we're talking with and knowing that the people that we're talking with have strengths and abilities, wisdom, their own values, their own journey. But that was happening more one-on-one. And I think what circles did for me when I was first learning was it helped me bridge relationships between other people.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, and I don't know that I've shared this on the podcast. I have a little bit of social work training. When I moved to Chicago, it was to attend a dual master's program with social work and social justice. And I ended up only finishing the social justice master's because the program at Loyola Chicago, no shade, was a little bit more clinically focused than I wanted, right? And when you're talking about that one-on-one therapy, I think it lends itself to seeing the problems in people more than their humanity. And I think also not necessarily looking at like meso and macro structures that have caused these issues. I'm curious, as you got into social work, and I know you went through a totally different program, how that, I think part of it is like what inspired you to think about social work as that route, and then what inspired you to do this in schools, and how have you seen your social work practice grow now knowing restorative ways of being? I know that was a lot in there.
Mm-hmm. So for me, it's about the journey, and it kind of goes back to what you said. Because for me, I grew up in the inner city of Milwaukee. My mom was worked very hard, but she didn't make much money, and so with me and my siblings, and so I got to experience poverty in growing up. And when I think about the pandemic, a neighborhood that I was living in for most of the time in the pandemic was pretty mixed. We had some middle class families and some who were more impoverished. There was majority African American families, so some others were there. And so it interconnects to even how I started off when I talked about like our children needing to be in school. Because many children weren't logging on, many children were playing outside. I remember witnessing someone next door to me, some children, looks like maybe sixth grade, who were smoking some marijuana. So there were a lot of difficult things happening when children were not in school. And so that interconnects with my own journey in wanting to do school social work. And transparency, when I was in high school, I used to skip school, not far from here. It started off in the bathroom, then I would go with my friends and we would go to restaurants because I didn't feel like I belonged, so I couldn't really put that into words. I had a group of friends that I was very connected to and wanted to spend time with them with that social side to growing up. And so that one day when I was skipping in school, someone came up to me and they said, Chauna, if I keep seeing you in the hallway with all the love, he was a great guy. If I keep seeing you in the hallway, I'm going to have to refer you to the school social worker. And I said, there's school social workers in schools? He said, yes. I said, are they on the 10-month calendar? He said, yes. I said, that is the job for me. True story. And interestingly, that was a job, that was a school where they had a human services track. So I always had this desire to help people, and that's a part of why I went to that high school. And I saw that as an avenue for being able to help people. So that's how I got into school social work. And for me, like, there's some similarities to a traditional social work track, but there's also some differences between a traditional social work track and a school social work track. And I always saw myself as someone who I wanted children, all children, to see that they were valuable and needed. And so that's why I say restorative practices very much connects with who I am when I think about the value of people.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're thinking about, that interconnection, right? Part of that is easy to see when it's like children who look like you, who are going through experiences that you went through, and wanting to help that. We also work in school systems, right? And you can correct me if I am making wrong assumptions about Milwaukee, but Milwaukee and public schools in general, right, are filled with students of color run by people who are not of the global majority, right, by white folks. As you've had to bridge those relationships, build those relationships with people who don't have the same life experiences, much less racial, ethnic background as you. How have you been able to use these ways of being to bridge that gap?
It started off with using the circle process. I did a lot of work around circles when I first got exposed. That's the part that I was drawn to. And there was a school that I was working at, transition high school, a school for students returning from incarceration, at risk of dropping out or returning from expulsion. And the staff there were, I would say, naturally restorative with their students and with each other. What they weren't familiar with was using that circle process. And so that was the part that I brought there. And even though it was a very restorative, they were very restorative in nature and their interaction, just like anywhere, conflict is normal and miscommunications can happen. And the circle process and allowing, just not allowing, but just creating the space for people to talk with one another around specific subjects, I saw gaps be bridged. A teacher who had one view of a student gets to talk in peace and share something authentically, and it's kind of like an aha moment for that teacher who only saw him or her or they in one certain way. And so it's in the process, it's in the practice, it's in the way of being, I think, that really speaks to being able to bridge. It reminds me of Kay Prentice and Carolyn Boyce Watson's seventh core assumption. We need practices to build habits of living from the core self. And that's what I like to do. It's morphed into me seeing a value for our staff as well long ago. And it's also morphed into recently, how are we being restorative in our daily interactions versus just when we're in circle? It's a continuous journey of learning and growing. Not there yet, work in progress.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what that journey for you has been to learning, like, oh, like, I learned this circle practice, but being in circle is more important when you're not sitting in circle, right? We're always living in this circle way as opposed to just, here's this thing that we did and now we're gone. What was the evolution of that for you? How have you invited other people into doing that?
Well, I started to notice that people were a certain way when we physically sat in circle. That was helpful for helping people be their best selves. But when we got out of circle, traditional or usual things happened that didn't help people be their best selves, is one way of saying it. Yeah. And so that's when I started to talk more about how we can be restorative in our daily walk, in our daily interactions. And I also started to think about how are we being restorative to ourselves. I think in my years of education, educators are some of the hardest working people that I know. And I don't think they always see their worth or their value for a variety of reasons. And so how do we use these practices to see that we're worthy as well as those that we are interacting with and valuable?
Yeah, it's almost like it has to be modeled for folks that, if we just go back to those core assumptions, good, wise, powerful, the true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful, right? Like the fourth one, I believe, is all humans have gifts and everyone is needed for what they bring. Like, and we can go on through these things. This podcast isn't a workshop, so I won't do that. But when we think about all of those assumptions and live those out, that's really impactful, not just in that circle space, but in all of the ways that we're in relationship with people. It's allowing us to see the ways that we're interconnected. It's allowing us to see that people's behaviors are communicating something. Sometimes when those behaviors are causing harm, it's about communicating an unmet need. But if we acknowledge that, the true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful, and that people want to be in good relationships, we then come to this understanding that people who are causing harm, like, don't want to be doing that. It's just like, what is the need that's trying to get fulfilled? As you've been doing this work in schools for, much of the last few years, how has that gone? Because there are always people who have been resistant.
I don't know what this means for me, but I don't see that a lot. What I see is people not feeling confident enough sometimes to leave circles. I see people who go back to what they know versus what they learned when things get difficult. It's been a long time since I have been in a professional development, led a professional development with someone who said they didn't believe in what we were talking about or what we were trying to do, not believing in restorative practices. I think that many people, I get the sense that people see the value of relationships. I also noticed that I started doing some things differently. For example, with the 7 core assumptions, I very much believe in every last one of those. Mm-hmm. But I also say when I'm talking with people about that piece, I share it, and I share it within the context of what you think impacts your communication and your interactions. What you think about people, what we think about people, what I think about a person tends to come out when I'm interacting with them, whether I want it to or not. My biases in a certain situation, they're going to come out. And so I use it to express the importance of really walking out of what you believe about people. And if what you believe about people is a little skewed, what kind of work needs to be done for you to kind of work through that so that every child and adult that comes into your presence knows just how valuable they are? And so going back to those 7 core assumptions, what are those that resonate with you the most? What are those that speak to you the most? What are those that can hold you when things get difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really key, like operationalizing those assumptions, but not just giving people like, here's the XYZ of how you embody this, turning it to them and saying, what would this look like for you? Because I think I share often that, it's one thing to ask a set of quote unquote restorative questions. What happened? Who was impacted and how, what were you thinking or feeling? How can we make this right? But if you're sitting across from a person and don't believe that at their core, they're good, wise, and powerful, worthy of respect and wanting to be in good relationship, that conversation is going to go very differently.
Yeah.
Right. And so is the conversation when you are, handing out the tests, or so is the conversation when you're welcoming them into the classroom. So is the conversation where you're having a conversation about classroom agreements or rules not being upheld. Right. And so, as much as this work is about those technical practices, as far as like, these are the questions that you can ask, those assumptions are so key. You said something about like, I don't know what this says about me that you haven't met a lot of resistance. It might mean that there are people working around you who have like continued to lay framework and really invite people into this work rather than mandate it. I think one of the things that I run into, because similar to you, when I'm running workshops through Amplify RJ, people are actively coming, wanting to participate. And so like, it's great because there is minimal resistance. When I go out into spaces where people are voluntold to be in this space, they're often, quote unquote, set in their ways. I'm here to teach my content. I'm not here to build relationships, right? Or even things like, I was taught that, building relationships with students was bad. As a male teacher, right, building relationships with students was a bad thing, right? Putting myself and them at risk, that's something that's been looked down on. I think you're right that there are people who do understand the importance of relationships, but it is just so different from what they have been doing, have been taught to do, have been socialized to do. And, change is always difficult for people.
Yeah, you make a great point. I think, I've been in this work for so long, and like I said, still ever evolving, that I'm learning about shifts that I can make that bring people to the work ever so slightly. And it's kind of fun because I'm such a people person, a people watcher. So I'm the one who was in elementary school. I stared at people. I still remember people saying, "What are you staring at? What is she staring at?" Because I'm so intrigued by people, the uniqueness of people. I just got older and learned how to control it. And so when I'm sitting in circle, it's kind of like a musical song, and it's kind of like a piece of art. I know this is just like truly speaking from my heart, because I see these different shades, personalities, colors that people are wearing as they're sitting in that space. I hear these different tones that people bring and bring in their authentic selves when they share. And so it causes me to do a lot of listening. And in that listening, I'm learning along the way as well. Thankful for the journey. Glad it's not done yet.
Yeah. I think the natural follow-up to that is like, what are some of the things that you've learned, maybe specifically about like the shifts that you've got to make, but is there any learning from sitting in circle, hearing from other people's perspectives that have really helped you in this work?
Well, outside of that one I mentioned with the 7 core assumptions, I think just because it's not the 7 core assumptions, is laying a foundation for people to embrace who they are, but also do some serious reflection and think about, like, what are those things that are getting in the way from them being able to do their best work with children and adults. And in part, it's like speaking that out loud and having those conversations. I think for me, I'm also learning how to ask questions that take people on this reflective journey to see where they are. And I've stopped talking about circles a lot. I use circles a lot in the professional developments that I do, but I continue to talk about and put words in the atmosphere to signify, like, how are we being restorative in our daily interactions, which causes them to think about that. I just got done doing a professional development, an 8-hour one. It was actually 4 hours one day and 3 hours another, with an equity team at one of our high schools, and it was 8 staff and 8 students, at a high school. And the conversation was so rich because of the way that it was set up. I don't do a lot of talking at. Mm-hmm. And they learn so much from each other. For example, they have a survey at this high school that students complete in the beginning of the year to build relationships, get to know the student. And one of the adult participants was thinking about that survey in connection to what they were learning, and was asking the students, like, how should I frame this question? Do you think we should add a question like this? Like, there was a few things that were happening that I think is going to help that piece even be richer for students based on this conversation. And so that very much connects to how are we being restorative in our daily interaction. So I hope that helps answer that question. And the way that questions are formed, having more conversations versus talking at people, I think that's one thing that's helped me in that piece. But I think also, again, I'm still noticing, I think with this work that we need, it's the same 7 core assumption to build practices, to have practices to build habits of living from the core self. Like, after a professional development, there needs to be some ongoing work that is happening for us to hold to it.
Yeah, I think one of the agreements, quote unquote agreements, that I bring into spaces where I'm facilitating is, right, we're all teachers and learners. And that's something that I learned from when I don't remember who first taught it to me, but when I was working at this organization called Alternatives in Chicago, right, this idea of I mostly don't want to talk in these spaces, right, because for a couple reasons. One, I have wisdom, experience, knowledge in these practices, but you all are experts in your community, right? So, like, I'm going to give you these things. How can you apply them? And, that 5th core assumption, everything we need to make positive change is already here, right? We can really dig into that, lean into that, and let people flourish and thrive based off of their knowledge in their community, right? You're not the expert in what equity means for that school, right? The people who are there on, like, even though, like, you're within the school district, you have wisdom and perspectives, like, the people who live and work there every day are there. I'm curious, when you think about this journey that you've been on, right, from social work to restorative justice, one of the things that stood out to me in your bio was that you've tried to align these practices or to strengthen existing structures, like SEL, IEPs, and PBIS. I'm curious how you've gone about integrating, restorative ways of being to those processes, specifically when thinking about PBIS. Because when I think about quote unquote restorative practices and PBIS, I think they similarly align. But when I think about the underlying assumptions that PBIS has about who people are and the underlying restorative assumptions, I don't think there's alignment. So I'm curious how you have done that kind of supportive structure work while working with things that aren't necessarily lockstep.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely been a journey here. I think an exciting one too. So when I first started making interconnections with PBIS, I just came from the lens of tiered systems of support. And so thinking about what are those things that we can do in a restorative way at a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3 level. And I really stayed there for a lot of the time that when I'm interconnecting those two. I found myself, though, in my current role, we have this equity, access, and inclusion department, and it has PBIS, equity, and restorative practices. And so I meet with the supervisors of each of those areas. And there's a piece around where we've really been integrating restorative work and changing the language, which also impacts the mindset. And I keep doing this because it's like these 5 different components to it. And because PBIS with the rule base can feel kind of rigid. So I hear what you're saying when you say they come from 2 different frameworks, but they're shifting that into being more restorative language, embracing more of that restorative framework and interconnecting it with PBIS from a multi-tiered system of support lens. So that's one thing that's been happening here. But I'm not a PBIS guru, I have to say.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that makes sense, right? As you were talking about the tiers, or MTSS for those of you who are all about your acronyms. And I should say PBS is positive behavioral instructions and support. Interventions and support.
Interventions and support,
and supports, right? I think a lot of the underlying rigidity of that is, at the core, humans are going to act out. So what are the things that we can do to incentivize them to be in line with the rules, right? Versus a restorative approach, humans at their core are good. What are the conditions that we can create for relationships to thrive, right, with each other? And rules aren't incredibly important within the restorative framework. There are agreements that we want to make with how we're going to be together. And, those things can be formalized or not, but what is the relationship? And so it's interesting to hear you talk about the way that you've bridged that gap, because I think one of the things that stands out to me, Adrienne Rich is a poet who Bell Hooks quoted, and I know it because of Bell Hooks. This is the oppressor's language, but I need it to speak with you, right? The words that we say might not 100% align to, our ideas of what those words should mean. But if we're using them to communicate in a way that other people will understand, those already existing supports, right? PBIS, that's a framework that people already know. How can we, in some ways, co-opt them for our own purposes, to give people steps towards being more restorative?
I think too that the exciting thing for me here is that people see they need to. The supervisor sees that we need to. And we also have a disproportionality manager who used to be the PBIS supervisor, who sees that we need to. And it's not just the restorative work, it's the culturally responsive work, and it's the equity work. So it's the interconnection of this work. And I think if not now, when I think about the pandemic and all of the implications behind that have come out, those things that people walk in daily that others are starting to see, some others are starting to see, where they have to shift. And children are responding the way they should appropriately respond based on what we're doing. Right? So when we give them rules and a lot of my way or the highway, they take the highway. Suspension out in the hallway. And so I think people are starting to listen. Some people. We're working at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Within the context of Milwaukee, where you've been for so many years, like there's definitely growth. And, we think about the Bay, Chicago, maybe like Minneapolis as these quote unquote hotbeds for restorative justice. But, this work is happening all over the country. You've been doing this work not just within Milwaukee, but on a national level too. Part of that is with NACRJ, which is the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. We've had Cheryl Wilson on here, who's the president. We've had a couple other people who have been in your role, like Jasmine Story on the advisory council. Can you share a little bit about the work that you've been doing nationally with NACRJ and other things?
Yes. So with NACRJ, I am the co-chair for the advisory council with Lorraine. And my work there has been really supporting the work of the board and the executive committee. And for example, when it comes to creating policies and procedures, I helped with the K-12 implementation guide. I worked with others on the advisory council to create that implementation guide that went through the board and executive committee for final approval and is now on their website as a resource for schools. I also help with, for example, we have the grants that people apply for. And so I help with like reviewing those grants and making suggestions on who should get those grants based on the rubric that we used for making those decisions. I help with the national committee for the conference that we have bi-yearly. Next one is in Chicago in June of 2022. So excited about that. And just kind of helping facilitating discussions around our advisory council that helps with a variety of things. We help with our higher education piece. We help with creating surveys to just learn what our members need and how we can improve. We are on we have some people who are working at a political level with really trying to grow restorative practices and really try to get us to think about like how do we interact at a political level, what kind of practices, policies, procedures do we have in place that values all people.
Two things. One, I don't know if it was you directly, but want to be transparent with folks that this podcast is one of those recipients of one of those NACRJ grants. So thank you so much if there was any direct interaction with that. But just wanted to put that out there for folks. The other thing, when I was talking with Cheryl on the podcast about how we act on a political level, I'm curious what that looks like because, the way that the state of affairs in our country is not very restorative, right? There are people who don't see each other as, good, wise, powerful humans when I think like there are some understandable reasons for that. If you don't value my life and the life of people around you by, putting on a mask when you go outside, much less, getting a shot, like, I don't know what to tell you, right? And I was talking to, my dad who works with somebody pretty closely who is pretty, like, anti-vax, right? So, like, how do we negotiate that? And that's just, like, on a person-to-person level. When we zoom out to the corporate state of, Wisconsin, state of California, or, the United States, what does that even look like?
Right. So for me, unfortunately, I can't speak to the specifics of that committee just because I'm not a part of that committee, but I definitely could connect you with some people who could talk more about it and would really love to talk, more about the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that have come up in the news, or at least came up in the news a couple years ago, where there were Congress people who were like passing a talking stick around the office, and it made
Yeah,
its way all the way around like our small restorative networks. Like, oh, look what they did! Like, we need to push them on. Like, we could do more of this. And who knows what actually came of that? But I would love those connections because as much as this work is interpersonal between people in small communities, like I do think that there are implications on the larger scale that I haven't fully tapped into. For me, it's just about like, it. So far, this project of Amplify RJ has been around, people even knowing what the words restorative justice mean, and not
mm,
just on that tier 3 of repairing harm, right?
yeah,
There
yeah.
are all these other things that go into that. I want to make sure that we covered everything that you wanted to cover. Um, is there anything else that you want to make sure that we share? Because if not, there are questions that I ask everyone. It's a little bit of a speed round, but it's never really that speedy. So I'm okay transitioning to that. But is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
I think for me personally, I'm worried about us. I'm worried about us. I'm worried. Us means people, and I think that this way of being is what could save us. And so for me, this work kind of has a life or death kind of kind of connection with me. I think about a student that was considering suicide, and I didn't know it till when when he was a student. I knew it when he reached out on Facebook as an adult, and so we have a responsibility to hear the people that we're with. It could be a matter of life or death.
How do you balance that with um, not being a martyr and taking care of yourself?
It's hard work. It's interesting. The older I get, the better I get at the balance.
Mm.
Um, Hope it doesn't take till I retire, but I've found myself doing more self care things and also just really listening to my family, um, with my husband and my daughters who say, "Hey, mom, haven't seen you for a while," even though we're in the same house. And taking that time for myself, my bike rides, my walks, my time alone, my weekend getaways, that really helps. Friends.
Yeah, 100%. That's that's so crucial. I was just thinking about my friend, shout out Sterling, who just moved away this weekend. I helped him move. I was like, oh man, like another. There's always Zoom, right? Um, but those times to like connect very intentionally with people, especially in this world where you're gonna say like, "Hey, I'm going to take this break to spend time with people who don't expect anything out of me other than like just my presence." Um,
Yeah.
it is so helpful. Um, I do have one more question that I want to ask before we get into those questions that I ask everyone. You said you haven't really experienced as much like opposition, maybe more like resistance to change. What would you give as advice to people who are wanting to implement restorative justice practices into their school community?
I would say try not to talk at people, but do things with people. I think is the biggest advice that I can give. And so, whatever material that you're going to use to talk about restorative practices, whether it's needs at the root of behavior, looking at the social discipline window, 7 core assumptions, or something else, whatever that piece is, how do you create a conversation around that piece? How do you give some information to explain what that is, but then create some conversation for people to actually have that time to self reflect? And I've noticed that's a lot of what's coming out in the sessions that I've offered as of late is like it helps me remember people might say to just really slow down and I got to think about and reflect on what I'm doing and how that's working out. And so that's what I encourage people to do is to talk with the people that they're with around the information that they're sharing as they're teaching them about the restorative work, no matter what the name, right? Like I do a little bit of talking around that because a name is a name. Restorative tends to be in, but I've heard of restorative measures, restorative justice, restorative practices. There's an intentional reason even why I use restorative practices and NPS. And that comes from my own journey and my experience. What's your journey? What's your experience for the word that you use? And what's interesting to me is no matter what the word, there's some people that I'm just like interconnected with, just even as I listen to you, that like we have this same foundation and what it means. So that would be my biggest advice. Be with the people that you're talking, that you're sharing information with. Listen, and that'll help you know which way to go next.
I do think that's a beautiful segue into, the first of the questions that I ask everyone. We've talked around it, but for you, define restorative justice.
So for me, I think of restorative work as a way of being. I think of it as a lens from which we interact with others. And that lens values relationships, values people. And I also think a lot about IRP's piece with this high accountability and high support. Mm-hmm. And I use that as a tool even when talking with educators about what does it look like for you when you're holding someone, even yourself, to a high level of accountability and giving yourself a whole lot of support at the same time. Because I think that can be kind of like a sweet spot for thinking about like how we do this work. So yeah, I don't really have a 90-minute speech. I got a definition that I show people all the time that even goes into those cultures and identities, but it's kind of like life work around relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. As you've been doing this life work around relationships, what has been like an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
Okay, so I have hearing loss. It just makes me think about when I was in circle with some students and I thought a student cursed. And I said, well, we really shouldn't use those kind of words in circle. And people were looking like, what is she talking about? And I said, well, what did he say? Because I learned that. And so that was kind of like one of those moments when, so that's hard for me because like having a hearing loss, it's so important to me to hear what people say. And I've had to get comfortable with myself because I kind of feel that to be a bit of a deficit in asking those questions. Like, could you repeat that or could you say that a little bit louder? It's really important to me for me to hear what you had to say. So that's one of those moments.
Well, I mean, I think that's a beautiful one, and the lesson that others can take from it is like knowing your limitations, right? And not being afraid to ask for clarification, for help, for assumptions, like not making assumptions. Because like in that particular moment, right, it was just like weird looks and then like everybody probably laughing it off. And maybe it was a moment of connection even, right? Like, but in other moments, like that could be more harmful. And so how do we make sure that we're asking for what we need, letting people know what we need, right? People can't be responsive to our needs if we're not communicating about them. That's a lesson that I just took from hearing that.
So well said, David. It's been a treat listening. It's a treat listening to you.
Oh, well, I try.
Yeah.
This one's a little bit of a thinker, or it's been a thinker for some people. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they, and what question do you ask the circle?
Well, interestingly, my grandparents come up first, and I've lost them recently. Well, my grandmother passed recently during COVID, but not because of it. So I see them, and I think that speaks to wisdom, that my desire for more wisdom, my desire to learn. Because I still want to know more from a historical context about their experience growing up in America. And who else would I want there?
Sorry, so 4 people. There are 4
4 people. 2 would be my
grandparents. Oh,
grandparents.
2 would be your grandparents. Okay.
Not for me. Not for me. Yeah. Um, on my mother's side, my grandparents, and 2 more people. I would say right now Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Mm.
And it's because of these differences in views and a historical context as well.
So you've got your grandparents, Malcolm and Martin. What is the question that you ask that circle?
I have a few, but I'm wondering, what are your top 5 lessons that you've learned in your life? That's one I would want to know. What do you appreciate about where we are now, and what do you think we need to continue striving for? That's what I would want to know. And I have to ask, like, what advice would you give me?
It's funny. I know you haven't listened to this podcast before, but sometimes I turn this question back on the guest. I'm not going to ask you to give advice to yourself. I'm not going to ask you to share the top 5 things you learned. I am going to ask you, though, what do you appreciate about where we are now, and what do you think that we have to continue to strive for?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that people around me are trying. I appreciate that. We have work to do. Our children are hurting. Doesn't mean we don't have some bright spots, but we can make it better. So I appreciate people are trying, and at the same time, we have work to do. And so let's continue doing the work. Let's get to work. Let's come together to figure out those things we don't know. Not just for them, but for us too.
What do you see as the benefit for them and us? And I'm making an assumption that them that you're talking about is white people.
No, that's easy. But in transparency, sometimes I witness people of color causing pain too in schools. And so we really need to take a good look at ourselves and what we're doing and how our children are responding, how we're responding to what we're doing. Race definitely is a struggle in there, and I've been learning a lot since I got back to MTS about whiteness, and whiteness doesn't just show up in white people. So that's the part that's disheartening. And I'm still like, I sit sometimes and I'm just like wondering, like, I don't get how the color of skin defines, how do we do that? It seems so trivial at its basic level for me sometimes, that just by looking at someone and the color of their skin, we can say they're bad or they're wrong or they're right and they're beautiful. And well, yeah, that's where we are sometimes. So for me, though, it's bigger than white and black or brown.
Mm-hmm. I guess, like, how are you characterizing the us and them?
I think I was thinking about students maybe and adults.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about schools. We talked a little bit about politics. I'm curious if there's like one place or situation that you've witnessed recently, and it could even be something that like you've seen in media that's like is a fictional situation. What is one place you wish people really knew this work?
So I was just thinking, like there was a time I was at a grocery store, a small chain grocery store, and I was followed in the store. Mm-hmm. And that's a time when I wish we could have restorative work. And I remember coming back and talking with the manager on another time, because typically I've had so many good experiences, and when I don't have good experiences, I tend not to shop there, which is a catch-22. But I think about, like, what if our people who worked in grocery stores got trained in using restorative work, and like how would that impact the interaction with each other and with the customers. Yeah, that's one place I think about is grocery stores.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I mean, I think that's perfect because, a lot of times people just pigeonhole this to like schools, criminal legal system, right? But like, really just want to draw out that it belongs absolutely everywhere.
yes,
Yeah.
it's hard to choose, that's for sure.
That was a perfect example. Um, as we start to transition out, I'm curious if there's one thing that you want everyone listening to know.
I think for me, it's together we can. That's been a big thing for me. That's been helpful for me, and I hope that it's helpful for someone else. Is that trying to do restorative work by ourselves is a very lonely and difficult place. But interconnecting with others, that is where the magic happens.
Yeah, that's what this work
Yeah.
is. Um, the collaboration, not commands or like even competing. Um, there's something that I'm writing that will be out by the time that this airs, around that idea. But that's really present for me. Um, two more questions, and this one requires a little bit more of you after this podcast. But who's someone who I should have on this podcast, and you have to help me get them here.
I think of Nikki Jansen. So I'm a supervisor and I supervise 7 restorative practices coaches. And Nikki Jansen is one of those coaches. Um, so I think she comes to mind. One, she's quite a powerful young lady, and she's done a lot of work from a community lens, as well as she's now a restorative practices coach for about 2 years. And I think she would have some really great things to share. Um, Another person I think about, though I haven't talked with them in a while, is I'm blanking on his name, Roderick. I know he has a personal story with how he got connected to restorative justice work, and I know he did some work in Rudy, in the Madison School District. So that's another person that I think about. So that's 2 people, Rudy Bankston and Nicole Jansen, also known as Nikki Jansen. You only asked for one though, huh?
That works. I'll take two. So I'm looking forward to those connecting emails. And then finally, um, how and where can people support your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
I would say that those who are in this restorative journey keep doing what you're doing, and those who are not, be open to considering it. Because this is our work. It's not my work. It's, I know that I have a role in it, and I can't think of a better way to help grow the work than more people doing it.
And also check out restorativetcs.com to learn more about all of the work that you're doing. Is that something that you want to plug for people?
You could, and it's just a balancing act. It's a balancing act. And how much I can help and how much, yeah, in both spaces. I have to do it really well or I can't do it at all.
Mm-hmm.
I do support some schools and some agencies through the Restorative TCS piece, just a little bit, because of my work in Milwaukee Public Schools.
Yeah. So we will link restorativetcs.com in the show notes. Capacity acknowledged because, right, there are lots of people doing this work, right? And we don't have to, like you talked about, like we need to do this work. We don't have to kill ourselves to do it. Is there anything else that you want to leave the people with?
Well, I just want to say that it has absolutely been a treat talking with you, David. And this might sound weird, but watching you, have this cute way when you talk, how you smile. And I appreciate your views and just kind of having a conversation with you. This has been really fun. I came in tired and I'm leaving energized. So thank you for that.
Beautiful. That's like that in itself is a win. Thank you so much, Chauna, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your time with us on the end of your first day of school with students. We're so grateful for that. Everyone else, we're going to have another great conversation next week. Until then, take care.
Elise here. Thank you so much, Chauna. This was an amazing episode. Chauna brought up some great examples of circles in action, and also she posed the question, how are we being restorative in our daily interaction versus just when we're in the circle? This helps us see that the real change that happens isn't just what happens in the circle, it's what happens afterwards and how you apply the circle methods and values into your own life. Chauna also posed the question, how are we being restorative to ourselves? As we go into a busy school year, as a student myself, I often forget self-care, and I'm sure my teachers do the same. Since we are all students and teachers, I think it is so important for us all to take care of ourselves. I challenge you to make one goal for yourself about self-care as we enter this next school year. You can even comment your self-care goal on our most recent Instagram post in order to share the love. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.